This video is about the spiritual ego. So I've been making a lot of videos about ego lately. And a big way to not focus on spirituality is to talk a lot about ego. And what normally is talking about ego is the ego. But these things are important to know about, to know the mechanisms that unconsciously or subconsciously operate and can divert somebody's spiritual progression. So the spiritual ego essentially is this idea of becoming more spiritual than you, or more spiritual than XYZ. It's turning it into some attainable goal in the way that, in the manner that someone may try to finish a race or make a certain dollar amount of money, or achieve some goal in terms of building something or crafting something. It's a very alluring thing because you can see, okay, a spiritual person is they have equanimity, they're calm, they're detached from their emotions, and they can list all these qualities. And then you manually try to make yourself like that and develop it into a sense of identity, a new sense of identity, right? So a spiritual person is not materialistic, and then you try to give up more of your material stuff, then you try to become the most poor person, the most astute beggar, right? And that's not in and of itself, it's not a spiritual action. It's an egoic action. The ego is so tricky, and you have to be aware of that. So some forms of the spiritual ego are competing with others with respect to attainment of spiritual qualities. And again, seeing these things and then making an identity out of it. So people with the spiritual ego, it's operating unconsciously, obviously, and it can be more damaging in a way than a regular ego. Because a regular ego, you can say, hey, you should probably stop drinking, you should probably stop this. You can point to negative actions that they're doing, right? And they can see it themselves. Now, the spiritual ego, though, leads to a sense of self-righteousness, and it leads to this very high, astute sense of self that is unquestionable and so forth, which is deceiving because it's this perfect matrix. It's this perfect personality that you've crafted, or that you're attempting to craft. And it only seems perfect. It's not actually. But you think you're spiritual, and so you're so happy about being spiritual and so gung-ho and so clung on to these specific ideologies and specific personality traits that there's no ability to actually move and bend with the moment. There's no ability to actually really see things clearly in a spiritual sense, most importantly. And there's no happiness that comes from it either, right? Because spirituality ultimately is about the cultivation of joy through realizing yourself as awareness, right? The total and full awareness that's beyond all of the psychological adaptations we have to the world, beyond all the physicality, beyond all the everything. It's about tapping into the one life, the awareness, the pure unconditioned awareness. And that pure unconditioned awareness is not bound up in a certain set of rules. Rules can be good and they can be helpful with regard to certain scriptures and so forth, no doubt. They can usher somebody along the right path and give them the right sets of habits and so forth. And those are not to be discredited, but they have their place, right? And then the true spirituality ultimately is in the removal of conceptual understanding of reality. And it's not by throwing concepts away, it's by moving beyond them. It's not by having no concept or anti-concept. It's about having the awareness, the awareness that precedes everything, that is underneath. It's the substratum of existence, substratum of life. So in certain spiritual groups, there is the spiritual ego. Right? And I talked to somebody in one of these groups once, and I brought it up, and he's like, what are you talking about? And I explained it very briefly. He's like, I've never seen that. I don't know what you're talking about. And I'm like, that must mean you have it, right? If you're not aware of this, right? It's so obvious from the outside, at least, right? When somebody has this very specific thing that they're crafting and being so meticulous about, and it behooves somebody to be aware of that. It's all ultimately about self-awareness. The spiritual ego can be a step in the right direction in the sense that you're doing spiritual practices and so forth, right? Like whatever those doctrinal practices may be, that can be helpful. It can push you on the right path. But it in and of itself is itself a very deceptive thing, because it's coerced by the ego, and the ego is very tricky. It doesn't care about the form it has. It doesn't care about whether you're known for good things or bad things. It wants to be known for something. It doesn't care if it's attached to something good or bad, whether the attention is good or bad. It just wants attention. It just wants to be something. There's this movie my friend was telling me about, 1917. And basically this guy gets killed. He's in the war, right? And he's almost killed, in the sense that he gets stabbed and he's bleeding out, and he's like holding on to this picture of his wife, and and he's holding on to, like, he's just trying to grab onto something before he leaves this world. Grab onto something, anything, right? It could be a rock and you probably want to grab onto it, right? That's the ego. It needs to grab onto something. The idea of nothing is horrifying. It's terrifying. Can't do that. Can't be nothing. Nope. Can't do that. I need something. And that's why people feel the need to fill their life with so much stuff all the time. And a lot of times that stuff, when it's coming from a desperate place or an uninspired place, it becomes cheap, tacky, uninspired, unintelligent, wasteful, whatever. Unfulfilling, that's for sure. Because you don't always need something. Not always. Right? In A New Earth, the Eckhart Tolle book, Eckhart says that the word Buddha means no man. Right? It honors the part of him that's a man, and it honors the part of him that's nothing, not a man, the spirit. See? That's why the Buddha did not define enlightenment as per any specific words, right? He didn't want it, as far as Eckhart's interpretation is, he didn't want to turn it into some type of thing that people can make something out of in their mind, right? He instead described it as the cessation of suffering, the absence of something, rather than the attainment of something, you see? Because the awareness underlies and predates and precedes all things, precedes all feelings, all psychologies, all dualities, all everything. All egos, material egos, spiritual egos, whatever the ego may be. So anyway, those are some words on the spiritual ego. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'm sure we all have a little bit of a spiritual ego ourselves. Let's all work to get that a little bit less. Or more importantly, more than that, just be aware. Always just be aware. To thine own self be true. Know thyself. The oracle said to Neo in the Matrix, the Latin sign. You know what that means? It means know thyself. Know thyself.